All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking into some of the recent legal maneuvering that's coming from Donald Trump's lawyers following his criminal conviction in New York.
Okay.
We're using as our source for this a breakdown, a really good one from the Ring of Fire YouTube channel.
Hmm.
And I think what we want to try to do is unpack their core argument
Right.
and what this tells us about when his sentencing might actually happen. So, Judge Juan Merchan set Trump's sentencing date for Friday, January 10th, 2025.
Yeah, and that happened when the judge affirmed that the criminal charges would not be dismissed.
Right.
So he upheld the conviction, so to speak.
Right, right. So the conviction stands.
Conviction stands.
And so, almost immediately following that, the defense filed motions with Judge Merchan to indefinitely delay the sentencing.
Right.
So let's just jump right into it. Like, what is their central argument for this delay?
Well, their core argument is that the sentencing hearing should be vacated.
Really?
And that all further deadlines should be suspended
Cool.
until, quote, President Trump's immunity appeals are fully and finally resolved, unquote.
Right.
And then they go on to say that they believe this resolution should result in a dismissal of the case.
Right, right. And one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was reading the Ring of Fire's analysis was that they call this a weak legal argument.
Right.
So I'm curious why it's considered so flimsy.
Well, it's important to understand how the typical legal process goes.
Right.
So, in civil cases, when there's an appeal to a verdict, oftentimes that will delay the actual payment of any damages that were awarded.
Right.
However, in criminal cases, things tend to proceed a little bit differently in terms of sentencing. So the execution of a sentence may be delayed while there's an appeal going on.
Right.
But the act of sentencing itself generally still moves forward.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So, arguing that a pending immunity appeal should actually stop the sentencing is a bit outside of the norm.
Yeah, that makes a really important distinction. Now, another thing I wanted to point out, there's a specific phrase included in the defense's filing that says, and this is a quote, which should result in a dismissal of this case, which should have never been brought in the first place.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's less of a legal argument and more just like a statement.
Yeah, exactly. The Ring of Fire really interprets this as an unnecessary and politically charged comment.
Okay.
So, they did have a legal basis, albeit a weak one, according to this analysis, for requesting a delay based on the immunity appeals. But throwing in this opinion about whether the case should have been brought in the first place really doesn't seem like it would strengthen their position.
Right.
And could even be seen as, inappropriate for a formal legal document.
Okay. So where does this leave Judge Merchan?
Yeah.
Like, can you just go ahead with sentencing on January 10th?
Yeah, technically he can.
Yeah.
The date is set. It's really up to the judge now to consider the defense's request for an indefinite postponement.
Right.
The Ring of Fire suggests that Judge Merchan could still very well hold the sentencing hearing on January 10th.
Okay.
It's important to remember that the actual implementation of a sentence, could be delayed.
Right.
While any appeals are going on.
Okay.
So sentencing doesn't mean immediate consequences.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So it really does seem like the big question is Judge Merchan going to agree to this delay?
Right.
And it sounds like the legal argument for an indefinite delay based on these immunity appeals isn't actually very strong.
Yeah, that's the main takeaway here.
Right.
According to the Ring of Fire, at least, this argument to indefinitely delay sentencing just because of the pending immunity appeals, it just doesn't really line up with the usual way that these criminal cases proceed.
Right, right. And I think, this really highlights how many steps there are in the legal process. We have the conviction, then we have sentencing, and then there's still these appeals that can come after that. And it makes you wonder, what are the real strategies at play here?
Right.
Like, beyond the stated reasons about the immunity appeals, what might some of the other motivations be behind this very specific legal move?
Yeah, that's a really important point to consider, especially given the high-profile nature of this case.
Right.
And the potential political implications, that come with each of these stages. One could speculate that the defense might also be aiming to influence the timing of these events in relation to, future political activities.
Right.
So, requesting an indefinite delay could serve purposes beyond the specific legal arguments that they presented in their filing.
Definitely something to think about.
Oh,
Well, this has been really helpful, really interesting deep dive. Thanks so much for walking us through this.
of course.
And we will catch everyone on our next deep dive.